Thank you, Kimberly, for that beautiful introduction, which I could not possibly follow up. And thank you, Dr. Van Hildebrand, for a talk that I thought it was going to be difficult to follow, but now I realize I was wrong. It's going to be impossible. I feel like just sneaking off and going home. If Adam was the first wimp, that makes me the second wimp. I guess by Chesterton standards, though, that makes me courageous. I am certainly in awe of this lady. The last time I taught a course on C.S. Lewis to 200 students at Boston College, nearly all those students agreed with nearly everything he wrote in a dozen books and a dozen articles that we read, except for one thing. Most of the students not only disagreed with, but felt very strongly that Lewis was scandalously out of line in opposing priestesses. In his wonderful little article, Priestesses in the Church, ? The issue looms large. Too large, I think. At least compared with the apocalyptic cosmic spiritual war we are in, as for the first time in all of human history, as the Pope has said, the eclipse of God has descended massively on the Western world. And yet there is a connection between this larger issue and this smaller one. Next to abortion, women's ordination is the most polarizing and passionate issue in the Church today. I do not think that I or an angel from heaven could convince and convert the 1/3 who are passionately committed to the cause for priestesses. But a sorting out and summarizing of reasons against priestesses and for the Church's teaching may help sway the 1/3 who are not passionately committed to either side, and it would be helpful for the 1/3 who are committed to the Church's position to take an inventory of their intellectual weapons. That is my purpose here. I don't think I have any new arguments, just restatements of others' arguments. But I don't know of any such summary of all the arguments that I could send someone to who asks me for it. The closest thing I know is an article that is, as far as I know, still unpublished by a man named Chris Kaiser, from which many of my arguments here are going to come. So, since I write the books and articles that I'd like to read, but can't because nobody else does it, so I have to, here is my attempt to summarize in less than an hour the Church's case for the controversial proposition that only boys can be the daddies. That's straight from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. I shall present only one side of the issue, the Church's side, because the arguments on the other side are very simple and very obvious. They come down to, why not? The idea of priestesses is not guilty until proven innocent, but innocent until proven guilty. The onus of proof, it seems, is on the Church's side. I will accept that onus of proof and try to prove the idea guilty. Before looking at the substantive arguments, however, I think it is useful and honest to look at ourselves and our prejudices first, because they are in fact operative in the discussion. 4 in particular move us today, all in the direction of saying yes to priestesses. The power of positive thinking, egalitarianism, guilt about male chauvinism, and the desire for peace. First, we always prefer positive thoughts and feelings to negative ones. We'd rather say yes than say no. But God gave us no as well as yes. Ann Landers defines personality as the ability to say yes and character as the ability to say no. We need both. We need negativity, limits, narrowness, borders, or else nothing will have definition and character. Without the negative, no positive. We especially hate limitations that make us suffer. Poverty, disease, weakness. I think God must have arranged our lives to be full of lived limits like these, partly because without such limits, there is no drama. One of the saddest things about being filthy rich, I imagine, is the lack of limits. you can do nearly anything, and therefore the lack of drama and bite in life. The rich always have a much higher suicide rate than the poor. The one society on earth with a 0 suicide rate is the poorest and most primitive society on earth, the Australian Aborigines. So it behooves us to say a preliminary hurrah for limits and barriers, and a yes to no in principle. But in fact, we say the opposite. Second, we, especially we Americans, are egalitarians. We hate discrimination. But discrimination is one aspect of limit, of the no. God discriminated between men and women in creating us different. We may rebel against this, but it is rebelling against our own nature. Already, by nature and the will of the Creator, men are barred from getting pregnant and childbirth. And women are barred from impregnating. God is just, but God's justice is far greater and richer and more mysterious than mere equality. God's justice is harmony, like music, not mathematics, like an equation. The ancients understood this justice because they lived in a natural cosmos, not a man-made and artificial one, surrounded by technological and political complexities and artifices. Human justice has a rightful concern for equality because we need to protect ourselves and our rights against others, like fascists, who would impose an unnatural and unjust inequality on us. But we also need to protect ourselves against those who, like the communists, would impose an unnatural and unjust equality upon us. It is simply not true that deep down we're all the same. The deeper down you go, the more the secret of our uniqueness is found. Ultimately, we find the difference between the heavenly and the hellish, the thoroughly and successfully human and the thoroughly and eternally inhuman, deep down. In the book of Genesis, not all discrimination and differentiation is between good and evil. God introduces distinctions into creation, including the distinction between male and female, for good. In fact, each act of creation is an act of discrimination. Light from darkness, waters below the firmament from waters above the firmament, land from sea, living from non-living, animal from plant, birds from fish, one species from another, man generically from animal, and man, male, from female. A third prejudice is that we men today are especially sensitive to women's demands out of guilt. A double guilt. First, guilt for past scorn and prejudice against women as inferiors by many of our ancestors. And second, guilt for present dehumanizing violence, raping, and battering by our brothers. But our ancestors and our brothers are not us. We are not personally responsible and guilty for their sins against women. Yet, though we may not rightly feel guilt for these sins, we do naturally and rightly feel shame, for they are our fathers and brothers. It's all in the family. If you found that Adolf Hitler was literally your grandfather, you would naturally feel shame for this black sheep in your family. Now, we want to relieve this shame and compensate for these wrongs, as affirmative action tries to compensate for slavery, or a professor bending over backwards to give a good grade to a student he dislikes and has been unfair to. The danger here is overcompensation, responding to past injustice by present opposite injustice, trying to make a right out of two wrongs. A fourth and less praiseworthy motive than the well-meaning but misdirected attempt to compensate for past wrongs is the fear of present trouble, the lust for comfort, the giving in to intimidation, the fanatical desire not to be seen as a fanatic, or modernity's other F word, fundamentalist. Get those pushy, pesty feminists off our back. Give them what they want. Americans, especially American administrators, including many church administrators, usually have a tremendous desire to be accepted, to be accommodating, to be nice. As Bill Cosby says about parents, we don't want justice, we want quiet. But these considerations decide nothing. They just warn us. What decides the issue is good arguments. Rather, what should decide the issue, any issue, is good arguments. I assume, perhaps naively, that everyone in my audience still believes in the existence and desirability of objective truth and the power of human reason to know it and even, sometimes, to prove it. If that faith is dead, so is civilization. Barbarism defeats all civilization very effectively, just as a bull defeats a china shop. I think this is the bottom line of Nietzsche's philosophy and of its progeny today, deconstructionism. There are at least 4 kinds of reasons against priestesses. First, reasons of authority. Second, reasons of sexual symbolism. Third, reasons of the ecclesiastical common good. And fourth, reasons of discernment. First, reasons of authority. These are the simplest of all. There are at least 3. The argument from the authority of God, from the authority of Christ, and from the authority of the Church. First, God. God is the one who invented the priesthood and who calls to the priesthood. The Church did not invent the priesthood. She received it. The Catholic Church claims less authority than any other Christian church in the world. That is why she is so conservative, so stuck in the mud. Protestant churches feel free to change the deposit of faith, for instance, by denying Mary's Assumption, or to change the deposit of morals, for instance, by allowing divorce, though Christ clearly forbade it in all 4 Gospels, or changing the essence of the liturgy, for instance, by denying the real presence and the centrality of the Eucharist in worship, which was constant church practice from the beginning. That historical discovery, by the way, played an enormous role in my own conversion from Protestantism. The Church, then, cannot change the nature of her priesthood simply because she is not its author, or even its editor, only its mail carrier. The Catholic priesthood was not the first priesthood that God invented. He created 2 others before it, the Levitical priesthood, which was set aside by Christ, and the priesthood of Melchizedek, which was fulfilled by Christ. Just as the Jews were not free to institute priestesses, neither are Catholics. All other ancient religions, except for Jews and Catholics, had priestesses, by the way. In a letter to the National Catholic Register, Lawrence Severson wrote, "No one can choose, much less demand, the priesthood. Christ said, 'You have not chosen me, I have chosen you.' The issue was closed right there. The chosen people did not establish the Jewish priesthood. It was established by the Supreme Being. All priests, he said, had to come from the sons of the tribe of Levi. Did God then discriminate against members of the other 11 tribes, both men and women? What an absurdity. God picks his priests, and they serve at his pleasure. When some men outside the tribe of Levi under Kor tried to perform the religious ceremonies, Moses warned them. When they continued to be obstinate, they were destroyed." Christ established the priesthood of the New Covenant. Man had no say in the matter. Christ exercised his authority as God, and also by his death on the cross, purchased the right to set the conditions under which all sacraments, including holy orders, are instituted and administered. One can wonder, however, why Christ chose only males to be apostles. The advocates of priestesses must say, and they do, that he bowed to cultural limitations, to deep-seated ancient male chauvinistic prejudices. But if Christ himself was subject to the limitations of cultural chauvinism, this is a denial of the incarnation, and thus the essence of the Christian faith. Imagine the absurdity and the arrogance of accusing Jesus Christ of the sin of sexism. In the second place, if he was not a sexist himself, but tolerated sexism in deliberately choosing only male apostles, then he's compromising with and fostering the sin of sexism by feminist standards. And this does not fit the pattern throughout the Gospels, where we see him unafraid to offend smaller and greater prejudices and sensibilities than this one. For instance, when he and his disciples eat with unwashed hands, and when he tells the Jews that they must drink his blood. So why would he succumb only to this one prejudice? In the third place, there was no consensus against priestesses in the ancient world. All the other nations had them, and the Jews frequently succumbed to the temptation of syncretism by imitating pagan practices throughout their history. Louis Boyer writes, "From the earliest civilizations of the Fertile Crescent through the Greece and Rome of the early Christian era, the ancients had always been accustomed to female priests who were not in the least in an inferior position to male priests. The male priesthood, contrary to contemporary popular prejudice, was an anomaly in the ancient world, as was the Jewish idea of a creator God, totally transcendent to the universe, who created its very matter out of nothing. As we shall see in our next main point, the argument from sexual symbolism, there is an intrinsic and necessary connection between this transcendence of God as creator and the male priesthood, and between the denial of the transcendence of God and the female priesthood. In both pagan polytheism and in pantheism, God is not outside nature but in her, either as a part, like Zeus, or as the whole, like Brahman. Thus, these religions can quite properly symbolize God as female, and they did. Only in Judaism and Christianity do we find the doctrine of creation proper and divine transcendence proper, and exclusively masculine imagery and pronouns for God, and an exclusively male priesthood symbolizing this. Further, there is no evidence at all of priestesses at any time or place in the New Testament or in the primitive church. There is, in fact, explicit evidence to the contrary in St. Paul. In addition to the authority of God in the Old Testament and of Christ in the New, the authority of Christ's appointed church for 2,000 years of uniform, unbroken, and unexceptionable practice and teaching supports priests and not priestesses. Even on a merely secular and human level, 2,000 years of uniform tradition that worked counts as empirical data. And, if you're truly democratic, as a vote from the democracy of the dead, to use Chesterton's wonderful term. The same Chesterton, always brimming with common sense, says that if we don't understand the reason for some ancient tradition or rule or institution, that should be a good reason for not abolishing it until we do understand it. If you come across a fence or a gate or a house in some unexpected place where you don't understand why it should be there, knocking it down because you don't understand why it's there is the really stupid thing to do. Knock it down, if you must, only after you understand its purpose and why it's no longer needed. But those who are advocating knocking down the old rule of a male priesthood freely admit that they haven't the faintest idea why the rule is there. Well, we do. So the only people who might have a right to change the old rule are precisely the people who don't want to change it. And the people who don't have a right to change it because they don't understand it are precisely the people who do want to change it. The Church is our mater et magistra, our mother and teacher. Let's have no mater si magistra no, from the right or the left. Ideology does not judge the Church. The Church judges ideologies. To be a Catholic is to believe that the Church and her traditions are more than human, that she is the body of Jesus Christ, graced with his real presence and power and promise of guidance. I have not yet once heard one advocate of priestesses face and affirm this fact, or manifest the loyal submission that all the saints had to our Holy Mother. When feminists become saints, we will become their pupils. The position I have stated here is no a priori prejudice against change in the Church. Many of the saints called for and carried out changes in the Church. The Church is a living body and therefore grows. But she grows from within, like a natural body, not violently or artificially like a machine or an ideology. As I shall show in main point number 2, a change to priestesses would manifest not growth and maturity, but an identity crisis. The Church has said no to priestesses not only from her beginning, from apostolic times, not only through nearly 2,000 years of past history, but also today. It is a simple and massive fact that the Church today has spoken, magisterially, officially, authoritatively, clearly, and publicly. What more does anybody want? Rome has spoken, the case is closed. That formula used to evoke love and loyalty. The issue today is not whether the Church will have priestesses. She won't. The only open issue today is whether the would-be priestesses will have the Church. The issue is not theoretical, but practical. It is a test of everyone's loyalty to the Church and therefore to Christ. For the head is not related to his body as a CEO to a business, but as that funny pink ball between your shoulders to the four-limbed flesh beneath it. To say yes to Christ but no to his Church is to will a spiritual decapitation. Today's rebels against the Church's authority on this or any other issue always misunderstand the very essence of authority. Authority does not mean power. It means right. More, it means author's rights. Christ is the author of the Church and has rightful authority over his own body, his own organs, that is, us, unless we are not his organs, his body, in which case we are not Christians, not sheep but goats. His sheep follow him, not lead him, because they know his voice, they recognize his authority. Now, this is all we need to say about the issue of priestesses. The case is closed. We can be certain of what is true and right here, even if we do not know or understand the reasons. But it is good to understand the reasons why. And the Church, like a good mother, has told us not only do this because Mommy says so, but also Mommy wants you to know why she says so. And her main reason is my second main point, the meaning of sexual symbolism. The first two things we learn about sex from God, right from the beginning, is that God designed it, not man or society, and that it is very good. The first command was, be fruitful and multiply. I do not think God had in mind growing oranges and memorizing times tables. It is significant that most advocates of priestesses do not seem to believe or care much about this. They usually see sexuality as a social, human, conventional, changeable thing, and they often see it as a problem, an obstacle, or even an enemy. In the case of radical feminists railing against the prison of having wombs and glorifying the act of breaking out of this prison by killing their unborn babies. If they see their bodies and their sexuality as theirs and not God's, it is quite naturally that they should proceed to the next step of seeing their babies as theirs and not God's. Advocates of priestesses usually misunderstand sexual symbolism, partly because they misunderstand symbolism itself as radically as they misunderstand authority. They usually think of symbols as only man-made and artificial. They don't see that there are profound and unchangeable natural symbols, that things can be signs. Aquinas based his multiple method of scriptural exegesis on this eminently sound but tragically forgotten principle. He writes, the author of Holy Writ is God, in whose power it is to signify his meaning not by words only, as man also can do, but also by things themselves. Thus, whereas in every other science, things are signified by man's words, this science, sacred science, has the property that the things signified by the words of Scripture have themselves a signification. Therefore, that first signification, whereby words signify things, belongs to the first sense, the historical or literal. And that signification whereby the things signified by the words have themselves a signification is called the spiritual sense, which is based on the literal and presupposes it. In other words, God writes history and nature as man writes words. Behind this hermeneutic is a metaphysic, the sacramental view of nature and history. Professor Howard has brilliantly pinpointed the difference between this ancient worldview in which everything means something and the reductionistic modern worldview in which nothing means anything in his title and book, Chance or the Dance. If everything in nature means something, then the big things in nature mean something big. And sex is a big thing. What it means is so big that we will never exhaust it. We can hope for ever-increasing, ever-changing insights into the facets of this diamond, but we cannot hope and should not hope to change its meaning, only to discover more of it. Every good poet knows that natural symbols are like the essential structures of language itself. The sky is, always was, and always will be a natural symbol for heaven. The ground is not. The eye's seeing is a natural symbol for the mind's understanding. The gut's desiring is not. We all know and recognize this unconsciously. That is why our language has evolved as it has, using the same word, see, for both literal physical seeing and symbolic seeing or understanding. Ascending light notes in a major key inevitably mean hope and joy. Descending heavy notes in a minor key inevitably mean something heavy, despair. Everything is connected. Everything points beyond itself, especially sex. God, who deliberately designed sexuality, also deliberately designed to incarnate himself as a male. Jesus Christ is still a male today. He still has his human body in heaven, and it is a male body. This is fact. This is data. This is not interpretation or explanation. I will now try to explain and interpret the Church's no to priestesses in the light of this data. My explanation can be summarized in two propositions. First, priests of Christ, who are Christ's mouths through whom he speaks the words, "This is my body," must be male because Christ is male. And second, Christ, the perfect human image of the Father, is male because God the Father is masculine. He, not she. To understand this second proposition, we must distinguish male from masculine. Male and female are biological genders. Masculine and feminine, or yin and yang, yang and yin, as the Chinese call them, are cosmic universal principles extending to all reality. Every pre-modern civilization knew this. English is the only language I know of which does not have masculine and feminine nouns. So it is easy for us who speak English to believe that the ancients merely projected their own biological gender out onto nature in calling heaven masculine and earth feminine, placing gods in the sky and goddesses in the earth, calling day and the sun masculine and night and the moon feminine. In the Hindu marriage ceremony, the bridegroom says to the bride, "I am heaven, you are earth." And the bride replies, "I am earth, you are heaven." I think it is incredibly provincial and even arrogant for us to assume, without a shred of proof, that this nearly universal human instinct is mere projection, mere illusion, mere fantasy, rather than an insight into a cosmic principle that is really there. There is abundant, ubiquitous, and obvious evidence for it from the bottom of the cosmic hierarchy to the top, from the electromagnetic attraction between electrons and protons to the circumcision of divine persons in the Trinity. Male and female are only the biological version of cosmic masculine and feminine. God is masculine to everything, from angels to prime matter. That is the ultimate reason why priests who represent God to us must be male. To say God is masculine is not, as so often said, male chauvinism. On the contrary, it makes us all female. To God, we are all his bride. All souls are feminine to God. He is he, and we are all she. The point can best be appreciated historically. Judaism was totally different from all the other religions of the world in three ways. First, there were no goddesses and no hermaphroditic gods. God, the only God, was always, only, and everywhere he. Therefore, there were also no priestesses.